Secretary Ross, let me begin with a statement that was released by the Foreign Minister of Canada and the Natural Resources Minister of Canada together just a short while ago. They said the government of Canada disagrees strongly with the U.S. Department of Commerce's decision to impose an unfair and punitive duty. The accusations, they say, are baseless and unfounded. You've said this is not a trade war or the first salvo in a trade war. Can we interpret this, though, as the opening move in a renegotiation of NAFTA?
Well, as you know, the president some 90 days ago announced that he intended to renegotiate NAFTA. So that's not a surprise. What we've been waiting on is for the Congress to give the go-ahead on the Trade Promotion Authority, the so-called fast track. So that's what's been holding up NAFTA. This case was brought a little bit ago and is a separate thing from that. It concerns some violations that are not permitted even under the old NAFTA, let alone under any new one. So while it's in parallel, it's not really linked to the NAFTA negotiations themselves.
What's the message here for government officials in capitals like Beijing or Mexico City? How should they interpret what's happened today with Canada?
Well, if you take what happened today with Canada in the overall context, we've been saying and proving that this administration is much more enforcement-oriented than the prior ones. We've been bringing lots and lots of cases. This is our second $2 billion+ fine just so far this year. And I doubt that there's been any year where there is even one in a whole year, let alone two in a couple of months. So enforcement is very much on the forefront in this administration.
In commenting on this particular move, the president spoke about oil in the same breath as he talked about timber and talked about dairy. Should the energy industry here be on notice as a result?
Well, I don't think there's any action the president immediately intends to take regarding Canadian energy. We are a very large customer of their energy. The president believes in the North America energy independence concept, and so I don't think that this has any particular implications for either the oil energy or the electricity energy that we also import from Canada.
Let's go back to February. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau was at the White House. There seemed to be a lot of good feelings, some happy talk from both sides. They're gathered at the White House. What's changed here in these intervening 2 months?
Well, I don't know that anything has changed in the relationship between President Trump and Mr. Trudeau, but whatever the relationship between the two of them, trade violations are trade violations and will be dealt with.
Chrystia Freeland and Jim Carr holding out hope here for a negotiated settlement, that you might drop this and come back to the negotiating table. Are you optimistic that that will happen? Could it happen?
Well, we would certainly be willing to do it. Where the negotiations broke off, there was quite a gap between what the Canadians were agreeable to and what the domestic producers were agreeable to. But we would be happy to receive a new proposal from the Canadians, and if that comes forward and shows some real movement, we would be happy to take it up with the American producers.
There's been an exchange of statements. Have you spoken to Canadian officials since this announcement was made?
Oh, surely.
And has the response been well captured by those statements? What have those conversations been like?
Well, they've been relatively brief, relatively just informative, but there have been no new proposals made.
This is a preliminary decision, I gather. It has to go through more levels of the Commerce Department yet, and there's going to go to the International Trade Commission, rather. How confident are you that it's going to get all the way through? In other words, there's a flash here with the announcement. How confident are you that it's going to be formalized?
Well, I think the work that was done on this preliminary finding is quite persuasive, and so it'll have to wend its way through the normal process, but they would not have come to the conclusion that $1 billion of countervailing duties were warranted if they didn't feel there was a very, very strong case.
Mr. Secretary, those countervailing duties were less than some analysts expected they would be. Could you shed a little light here on how you came up with the numbers themselves?
I can't imagine that they're less than people thought they would be. The range that the people I'd heard speculate, people outside, was 10 to 20%. So I don't know where you got the idea that it could be a lot more than 20%.
Just from analyst commentary. Let me ask you about Robert Lighthizer. We saw his nomination advance through committee just a few minutes ago. This is something that he talked about an awful lot during his confirmation hearings. This is an issue that he's particularly interested in. Help me understand the timing here. Why not wait until he gets an up or down vote in the Senate to go ahead with what you did today?
Well, first of all, there are statutory time periods by which decisions must be reported, and we would have had flexibility to do it either yesterday, which we did, or today. We chose yesterday, but today was the outside limit in any event.
When you look at the health of the U.S. economy, you have to pay attention to the housing sector as a part of that. How much were you thinking about that calculus here, that this could have a deleterious effect on the U.S. housing sector if this wood does indeed become more expensive?
Well, something like 7% of the cost of a house is in lumber, this kind of lumber. And if this added a full 20%, which I don't think it will, but if it added a full 20%, that would be a 1.4% increase in the cost of building a house. That's not a very material number.
Just want to step back and look at this broadly here. We hear the president talking about America first. There's an interest in bringing more jobs back here, using more American steel, for instance. To somebody watching all of this unfold, how is that different in principle than a country backing its industry, be that dairy, be that steel, be that timber? What's the difference there between what the president is saying and doing and what's being done in other countries?
Well, in the terms of the lumber thing itself, we believe that what they did was illegal, was impermissible. The president is not advocating doing anything that's illegal or impermissible.
Is this a new strategy, just circling back to where we began a few moments ago? You talk about the impulse here to do more enforcement. Do you see this administration targeting more sectors, more countries in sort of specific terms as you did over these last 2 days?
Oh, we will continue to, no question about that. We also are starting an activity called self-initiation. And what that means is the following. Normally, commerce has waited for an industry to get itself organized about protesting a particular product from a particular country. Then they filed the case. Then we examine their papers and we process the case. That takes a long time. Self-initiation would mean commerce would initiate the case on its own. That would cut out months of work, cut out lots of expense on the part of the industry participants, and we think it's a very good way to go, because one of the problems with trade cases is they take too darn long, generally a year and a half to 2 years, and that can be such a long period that the target company dies while it's waiting for the relief to come.
Secretary Ross, last question here about China. You were down at Mar-a-Lago when the Chinese president visited with the president of the United States there. We've heard the president talk about trade and China in a broader context about national security since then. Has this administration's trade policy toward China changed as a result of that meeting in Florida a couple of weeks ago?
I don't think the trade policy has changed, but what has changed is overall relations have gotten much better. There's a good personal rapport between our president and Mr. Xi. That rapport was quite evident down at Mar-a-Lago, and it has continued with subsequent phone calls between them. And plus, we get the feeling that the Chinese are becoming a lot more helpful, potentially, with North Korea than they had been historically. So that's a good thing.
Quickly here, can you give us an update on that report you were commissioned to produce by that executive action a couple of weeks ago?
Which one? There have been 10.
Looking at countries in specific, this was to be the most ambitious look at the trading relationship that companies have, and that was called for by that executive action from the president.
Right. Well, that would constitute the first systematic review of our trade agreements ever. And when you think about the number of years we've had some of these agreements, the idea that there'd never been a systematic review is quite shocking. So that's what we're going to be doing. And the purpose of it is to try to figure out what should be our priorities in terms of which agreements to work on, which countries to work on, which industries to work on, so that we maximize the bang for the buck we get out of the intellectual activity.